October the 14th, 1066. The day England changed forever. Two armies stood face to face, each led by a man determined to claim the English throne. On one side, Harold Godwinson, the newly crowned Anglo-Saxon king. On the other, William, Duke of Normandy, a man who believed the throne was rightfully his. The battle that followed wasn't just about who would wear the crown. It would reshape England's future, its culture, its laws, even its language. This is the story of the Battle of Hastings, the battle that decided the fate of a kingdom. The year was 1066, and England was in turmoil. King Edward the Confessor had died without a clear heir, leaving the throne up for grabs. The English nobility chose Harold Godwinson, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, as their new king. But not everyone accepted this decision. Two rivals had their own claims to the throne: Harald Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway, and William, Duke of Normandy, who insisted that Edward had promised him the crown years before. Harald Hardrada struck first. He sailed from Norway with a massive army, intending on seizing the throne for himself. Harold Godwinson had no choice but to march north and meet him in battle. On September the 25th, 1066, the two sides clashed at Stamford Bridge in a brutal fight that saw Hardrada and thousands of his warriors cut down. The Viking threat was crushed, and England was safe for now. But even as the Anglo-Saxons celebrated their hard-fought victory, a new danger was already on its way. While Harold and his men were fighting in the north, William of Normandy had landed on the southeastern coast of England. He had come with one goal: to take the throne by force. Harold now faced an impossible task. His army was battered and exhausted from fighting the Vikings, yet he had no time to rest. William was advancing, and if Harold didn't stop him quickly, England would fall. So, without hesitation, Harold turned his men around and marched south, covering nearly 250 miles in just a few days. He was determined to protect his kingdom, but what awaited him at Hastings would be unlike anything he had faced before. By early October, Harold and his weary soldiers had arrived in the south. William, in contrast, was fresh and well prepared. His army had spent weeks fortifying their position near Hastings, gathering supplies and planning their attack. For both leaders, this battle would be all or nothing. Whoever won would rule England. Harold's forces were mostly foot soldiers, made up of professional warriors called housecarls, and local militia known as fyrdsmen. Their greatest strength was the shield wall, a powerful defensive formation that had served Anglo-Saxon armies well for centuries. If it held, breaking through would be nearly impossible. William's army, however, was more diverse. He had armoured knights on horseback, skilled archers, and well-trained infantry, each bringing a different advantage to the fight. Unlike Harold's men, many of William's soldiers were veterans of previous campaigns, used to fighting in different terrains and against different tactics. Harold's strategy was simple: hold the high ground, let the Normans wear themselves out, and keep the shield wall intact. William, however, had other plans. He had studied Harold's army carefully and was prepared to do whatever it took to break through. As dawn broke on October the 14th, 1066, the two armies stood ready. The fate of England would be decided that day. The Battle of Hastings was about to begin. On the morning of October the 14th, 1066, the battlefield was set. Harold's Anglo-Saxon army had taken position on Senlac Hill, standing shoulder to shoulder behind their famous shield wall. Below them, William's Norman forces were ready to attack. Both sides knew what was at stake. Whoever won this battle would decide the future of England. William had a plan. First, he sent in his archers, launching volley after volley of arrows at the English lines. But the shield wall was too strong. The tightly packed warriors raised their shields, blocking most of the incoming fire. A few arrows found their mark, and Harold's men stood firm. Seeing that the archers weren't making an impact, William ordered his infantry and cavalry to charge. Norman foot soldiers and heavily armoured knights on horseback surged forward, slamming into the English defences. But the shield wall held. No matter how hard the Normans pushed, the Anglo-Saxons pushed back. Then, things started to go wrong for William. A rumour spread that he had been killed, and panic broke out in the Norman ranks. Soldiers started retreating, thinking the battle was lost. But William wasn't dead. He pulled off his helmet, raised his sword, and shouted that he was still alive. His men saw him and quickly rallied, charging back into the fight. Still, no real progress had been made. The shield wall remained unbroken, and time was running out. If the English held their ground until nightfall, Harold would remain king. William needed a new strategy. Realising that brute force wasn't working, William decided to trick the English. He ordered his cavalry to pretend to retreat, to turn and flee as if they had lost. Harold's men saw the Normans running and thought they had won. Groups of Anglo-Saxon soldiers broke formation and chased after them, eager to finish them off. That's when the Normans turned back and attacked. The English who had left the shield wall were completely exposed, and many were cut down on the spot. Their trick worked, and gaps started appearing in Harold's lines. The Norman cavalry took advantage, charging through the openings and tearing into the Anglo-Saxon army. Then came the moment that sealed England's fate. At some point during the battle, Harold was killed. Some say he was struck in the eye by an arrow. Others believe he was cut down by Norman knights. Either way, with their king dead, the English lost all hope. Without a leader, Harold's army began to collapse. One by one, the soldiers started fleeing the battlefield. The shield wall was gone. The fight was over. William had won. England now had a new ruler, William, Duke of Normandy, who would soon become William the Conqueror. With Harold dead and his army scattered, the battle was over. The Anglo-Saxons who remained tried to flee, but many were cut down as they ran. Those who survived surrendered or disappeared into the countryside. The once mighty English army was gone, and William of Normandy had won the fight for the throne. But winning the battle was one thing. Securing the kingdom was another. Harold was dead, but England was not ready to accept Norman rule overnight. There were still other nobles who could resist, and the people of England had spent centuries under Anglo-Saxon kings. William knew that if he wanted to rule, he had to move fast. So, instead of celebrating, he and his army marched towards London, crushing any resistance along the way. Towns and villages surrendered as William's forces burned and looted those who refused to submit. Step by step, he forced England into submission. Then, on Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Anglo-Saxon era was officially over, and the Norman rule had begun. Winning the Battle of Hastings gave William the crown, but England wasn't ready to accept him as king just yet. Defeating Harold on the battlefield was only the beginning. Now he had to hold on to power, and that wouldn't come easy. For generations, England had been ruled by Anglo-Saxon kings, and the idea of a Norman sitting on the throne didn't sit well with the English nobles. Many of them had fought alongside Harold at Hastings, and those who survived had no intention of bowing to William. Across the country, whispers of rebellion began to spread. William, however, wasn't about to let his new kingdom slip through his fingers. He had won the throne by force, and he was prepared to keep it the same way. Trouble started almost immediately after William's coronation. Anglo-Saxon lords who had lost their lands to Norman nobles refused to accept their new overlords. Small uprisings broke out, with English thanes, local lords, attacking Norman-held estates and ambushing soldiers. William responded swiftly, marching his forces from town to town, crushing any resistance he found. But these local rebellions were just the beginning. In 1068, a much larger threat emerged. Edwin and Morcar, two powerful Anglo-Saxon earls, led an open revolt against Norman rule. They were joined by other English nobles and even received support from the Scots. William, unwilling to risk a full-blown war, marched north with his army. One by one, the rebellious towns fell to the Normans. Edwin and Morcar surrendered, and William tightened his grip on the country. It seemed as though resistance had been stamped out. But then, in 1069, everything changed. The most serious rebellion William faced came from the north of England, where Norman rule was particularly hated. The people of York and surrounding areas rose up against William, slaughtering Norman garrisons and reclaiming their lands. Even more concerning for William, the rebellion wasn't just an internal uprising. The rebels had powerful allies. King Sweyn of Denmark sent a fleet of Viking warriors to support the Anglo-Saxons. With their help, the city of York was captured, and Norman control over the north was in serious jeopardy. For the first time since Hastings, William's rule was at real risk. If the rebellion spread, it could inspire other regions to rise up, and William's hold on England would unravel completely. He couldn't afford to take any chances. His response was swift, brutal, and devastating. Determined to crush the rebellion once and for all, William launched a campaign of destruction across the north, what became known as the Harrying of the North. Villages were burnt to the ground, crops were torched, livestock was slaughtered, and anyone suspected of aiding the rebels was hunted down and executed. Those who survived were left to starve, as the land had been made completely barren. By the time it was over, the north of England had been devastated beyond recognition. It's estimated that tens of thousands of people died, either in the fighting or from famine. For years after, the land remained empty and ruined, a grim reminder of what happened to those who resisted William's rule. Despite the horror of the harrying of the north, resistance still wasn't completely over. In 1070, Hereward the Wake, the famous Anglo-Saxon noble, launched a guerrilla-style rebellion from the Isle of Ely. Using the marshlands as cover, he and his men raided Norman-held towns and ambushed William's soldiers. For a time, he was a major problem for the Normans, but eventually his forces were either captured, killed, or forced to flee. Smaller uprisings would continue over the next few years, but none posed a serious threat to William's rule. The Norman grip on England was now absolute. By 1075, all major rebellions had been crushed, and William had firmly secured his rule. But it had come at a massive cost. Thousands of lives had been lost, towns and villages had been wiped from the map, and entire regions had been left in ruins. The Anglo-Saxon ruling class had been completely wiped out, replaced by Norman lords loyal to William. The feudal system had taken hold, and England was no longer the same country it had been before Hastings. But William had done what he set out to do. He had conquered England, and no one would challenge him again. By 1075, William the Conqueror had complete control of England. The Anglo-Saxon resistance had been crushed, rebellions had been put down, and Norman rule was firmly in place. But the changes William brought to England went far beyond the battlefield. The Norman conquest didn't just mean a new king. It transformed England's culture, language, laws, and even its landscape. The country that existed before 1066 was gone, and a new England had begun. One of the most immediate and dramatic changes was the complete overhaul of England's nobility. Before Hastings, England had been ruled by Anglo-Saxon lords and thanes, who owned land and governed their territories. After William's victory, almost all of them were stripped of their lands and titles. In their place, William installed his own Norman barons and knights, rewarding those who had fought for him. Within a few years, over 90% of England's land was in Norman hands. The Anglo-Saxon elite was completely wiped out, replaced by a French-speaking Norman aristocracy. For the English people, this meant that their new rulers spoke a different language, followed different customs, and enforced different laws. Overnight, the very structure of English society had changed forever. Under Anglo-Saxon rule, land ownership had been made more flexible, and many local lords had a degree of independence. But William introduced the feudal system, a strict hierarchy that ensured all land belonged to the king. In this system, William owned all the land, but granted large estates to his most loyal barons. Those barons, in return, swore loyalty to him and provided knights and soldiers for his army. The knights, in turn, were given smaller portions of land, which they controlled in exchange for military service. At the bottom were peasants and serfs, who had little to no rights and were expected to work the land in exchange for protection. This system tied everyone to the king, making sure power was concentrated in William's hands. It also created a society where English peasants had almost no power, while Norman lords controlled everything. For the average person, life became much harsher under Norman rule. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just another medieval battle. It was the moment that changed England forever. William's victory didn't just put a new king on the throne. It completely transformed the country. After the Normans took over, everything started to change. Castles, something almost unheard of in Anglo-Saxon England, began appearing all over the land. French words mixed into the English language, shaping how we speak today. A new feudal system was introduced, shifting power to William's Norman lords and making Anglo-Saxon nobles second-class citizens in their own country. And perhaps most famously, the Domesday Book was created, a massive survey of England's lands, people, and wealth. It gave William total control over his new kingdom and showed just how deep his influence ran. Nearly 1,000 years later, the effect of Hastings can still be seen in England's laws, its culture, and even its royal bloodline. The battle that took place on that October morning in 1066 didn't just decide who would wear the crown. It shaped the future of an entire nation. So, what do you think? Was William's victory inevitable? Or could Harold have turned the tide? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of history's greatest battles.